On November 11, 1918, the United States was celebrating the end of the First World War. But thousands of miles from home, American soldiers were fighting the Red Army in a frozen Russian village. Artillery shells crashed into wooden houses. The Reds attacked from several directions. One force moved through the forest, reached the American rear, and captured a dressing station filled with wounded men who could not defend themselves. The village was called Tulgas. It stood deep in northern Russia, almost 200 miles from the nearest seaport, and the Americans had no idea when they would be able to leave. The Allied garrison at Tulgas included American and British soldiers, Canadian artillery crews, and Russian anti-Bolshevik troops. The Red forces were trying to capture the Allied guns and split the defenders in two. The Americans counterattacked through the village. The artillery crews fired at almost point-blank range. The battle continued for several days. 7 Americans were killed. 23 were wounded. After the fighting, the Allies evacuated the residents from part of the village and burned their homes, so the Red Army could not use them as defensive positions during the next attack. The decision made military sense. For the local families, it meant they no longer had homes to return to. The Americans had officially been sent to Russia to guard military supplies near Arkhangelsk. So how had they ended up in a village almost 200 miles from the port, fighting in someone else's civil war? Before the revolution, Britain, France, and the United States had sent Russia weapons, ammunition, equipment, and food. Much of it was stored in warehouses across the country's major cities. Some of the shipments had been paid for, others had not. They were meant to help the Russian army continue the war against Germany. Then, the Bolsheviks seized power. They pulled Russia out of the World War and refused to recognize the debts of the governments they had replaced. At the same time, they began removing military supplies from the northern ports. To the Allies, the situation seemed straightforward. The new regime rejected the old government's financial obligations while taking possession of weapons that had been supplied to that government. The first foreign troops arrived in northern Russia not against the wishes of the local Soviet authorities, but with their cooperation. Fearing a German or Finnish advance, the Murmansk Soviet began working with the British. The central government in Moscow soon ordered it to stop. The Murmansk authorities refused. The intervention was built on a contradiction from the beginning. Some Soviet officials invited foreign troops in. Others demanded that they leave immediately. The United States did not recognize the Bolsheviks as Russia's legitimate government. Even so, President Woodrow Wilson resisted sending American troops into the country for months. He feared that a foreign invasion would strengthen Bolshevik propaganda and give Japan an opportunity to dominate Siberia. In the end, Wilson approved a limited operation. American troops were to protect military supplies, help local forces organize their defenses, and avoid interfering in Russia's internal affairs. On paper, the instructions seemed clear. In the middle of a brutal civil war, they were impossible to follow. In August 1918, British and French forces occupied Arkhangelsk, overthrew the local Soviet, and helped establish an anti-Bolshevik administration in the city. The Americans arrived about a month later. They were issued unfamiliar Russian rifles and placed under British operational command. Officially, they were there to protect the warehouses near the port. British commanders argued that the port could not be defended by remaining beside the warehouses. To keep the Red Army away from Arkhangelsk, they sent American units hundreds of miles inland along the railway and the northern Dvina River. The British wanted more than a secure port. They hoped to link up with anti-Bolshevik forces farther south and rebuild a front against Germany. Washington had approved a limited mission. British command turned it into an offensive. The disagreement became so serious that the US Secretary of State threatened to remove American units from British command. The threat was never carried out, and the soldiers continued moving south. At the same time, the Soviet leadership began to regard them as interventionists and military enemies. The attack on Tulgas was therefore not an accidental clash. It was part of an effort to drive the Allies back toward the sea. The Bolsheviks' next major target was Shenkursk, where American and Allied forces had established positions almost 300 miles from Arkhangelsk. Their forward line projected deep into Red-controlled territory, while the long supply route left the garrison dangerously exposed. Soviet commanders decided to surround and destroy it. In January 1919, the Red Army launched an offensive. After several days of heavy fighting, the Allied forward units withdrew into Shenkursk. But Red forces were moving around the town and closing on the only road the garrison could use to retreat north. If that road were cut, roughly 1,500 Allied soldiers would be trapped. During the night, the order came to evacuate. The main road could not be used. Instead, the column escaped along a little-known forest trail that the Reds probably had not yet discovered. The wounded were placed on horse-drawn sledges. Medical personnel, Russian troops, and hundreds of civilians joined the retreat, fearing reprisals when Soviet authority returned. They moved through the forest at night, without lights, trying not to reveal their position. The artillery, supply depots, and much of the garrison's equipment had to be abandoned. The Red Army discovered the withdrawal too late, and the garrison escaped encirclement. But Shenkursk became the greatest defeat of the Allied expedition in northern Russia. It also forced the Americans to question the entire mission. They had been sent to guard warehouses by the sea. A few months later, they were retreating through a forest at night, almost 300 miles from those warehouses.
After the World War ended, the soldiers began asking the same question more often. Why were they still fighting? In the spring of 1919, one American company was ordered back to the front. The men refused to load their equipment onto sledges until their commanders explained the purpose of the operation.
Colonel George Stewart, commander of the American contingent, came to speak with them in person. He warned them about the consequences of refusing orders. The soldiers asked Stewart directly why the United States had sent them to Russia at all. He admitted that he could not give them a clear political answer. American units already held isolated positions, and the Red Army was still advancing. They could not simply lay down their weapons and walk away. A withdrawal first had to be organized. Until then, the soldiers had to hold the line. The company obeyed the order. The War Department later insisted that no full-scale mutiny had taken place. Technically, that was true, but Stewart's answer revealed what the expedition had become. The soldiers were no longer fighting for a goal they understood. They were fighting because earlier decisions had carried them to a place they could not simply leave. The same question was being debated in Washington. A proposal to withdraw the troops from Russia produced a tie in the Senate. The deciding vote went against immediate withdrawal. Soon afterward, however, the American government announced that the northern contingent would return home. But the White Sea was still locked in ice. Even after the decision had been made, the soldiers could not leave Arkhangelsk for several more months. Most American troops departed northern Russia only in the summer of 1919. At the same time, another American expedition remained active in Siberia and the Russian Far East. It would stay in the country for almost another year.
Officially, the American expedition in Siberia was sent to assist the Czechoslovak Corps, an Allied army stretched along the Trans-Siberian Railway and trying to leave Russia through Vladivostok. The Americans were also expected to protect the railway and prevent Japan from gaining sole control of the region. General William Graves was given command of the expedition. Before Graves left, the Secretary of War handed him Wilson's instructions. Do not interfere in Russia's internal affairs. Do not take sides in the Civil War. Guard the railway and help the Czechoslovaks evacuate. Graves interpreted those orders literally. By the time he arrived, some American troops had already taken part in a joint offensive under Japanese command. Graves decided that from then on, the Americans would act independently and remain strictly within Wilson's instructions. This was not a ceremonial dispute over seniority. The United States sent about 8,000 troops to Siberia. Japan had initially promised a comparable force. Instead, it deployed more than 70,000. Japanese troops controlled vast stretches of the railway and supported local Ottomans who operated almost independently of the central white government. Britain and France wanted to turn the Allied expedition into open support for the war against the Bolsheviks. Graves refused. 4 powers had entered Siberia as allies. Each was pursuing a different objective.
Graves announced that American troops would protect trains, passengers, and railway workers regardless of their political views. It sounded neutral, but the railway was Siberia's most important military resource. Kolchak used it to supply his army. The Czechoslovaks used it to move toward Vladivostok. The Japanese and the Ottomans they supported used it as well. Partisans blew up bridges and stopped trains to cut their enemies off from supplies. Every locomotive, bridge, and freight car affected the course of the war. The Americans could not guard the railway without becoming involved in the struggle around it. That summer, several American soldiers were captured by Red partisans. 3 were taken while fishing. 2 more were seized separately. An attempt to free them by force left 4 Americans dead, while the prisoners remained in partisan hands. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Eichelberger then went to negotiate with the enemy. His unit was holding a captured Red commander, and he arranged to exchange him for the 5 Americans. Every prisoner returned alive. The military operation had failed. Negotiation with the enemy succeeded. But the most dangerous threat to the Americans in Siberia may not have been the Red Army at all. The American government had promised to supply weapons to Admiral Kolchak's army. Graves delayed the shipment. He feared the rifles would fall into the hands of Ottomans protected by Japan and might eventually be used against the American expedition. Formally, these commanders recognized Kolchak's government. In practice, they did not always obey it. Representatives of the White Admiral offered to pay $1 million in gold for the weapons. Graves refused. Washington ordered him to fulfill the commitment, but also to prevent the rifles from being seized by outside forces. The trains were therefore sent west under American guard. Graves' fears were confirmed almost immediately. At Chita, Ataman Grigory Semyonov stopped one of the trains and demanded 15,000 rifles. Cossacks and armored cars appeared around the station. The American guards refused to surrender the weapons. Graves sent a brief order: do not hand over a single rifle. The situation was absurd. For almost 40 hours, American soldiers guarded the weapons against a white commander who was formally subordinate to the government the rifles were meant to support. Japanese troops backing Semyonov stood nearby. In the end, the train was allowed to continue. Washington was arming Kolchak. Graves was protecting the weapons from Kolchak's allies. Japan was supporting men the Americans did not trust. In practice, there was no unified Allied policy in Siberia.
The bloodiest battle of America's Siberian expedition took place near the small village of Romanovka in the Russian Far East. 72 American soldiers had made camp in a low area beside the railway. A steep hill rose above their tents and overlooked the entire position. Before dawn, Red partisans occupied the height. At about 5 a.m, they opened fire on the sleeping camp. The first volleys tore through the tents. A bullet shattered Lieutenant Lawrence Butler's lower jaw. He could not speak, but continued directing his men with hand signals. Butler pulled the survivors first behind a stack of firewood, then into the village houses. 3 soldiers covered the retreat. Inside the houses, medics and local women treated the wounded. A Polish nurse ran into the gunfire to carry soldiers into shelter. In one cellar, a Russian woman worked beside the American medical staff. Her 3 children were close by. The Americans later recalled that when someone asked the woman where her husband was, she pointed toward the hill from which the partisans were firing.
The garrison needed reinforcements. 2 messengers escaped the village and reached the railway. There, they found a train guarded by only 17 Americans. One messenger wanted to take it straight to Romanovka. Sergeant Sylvester Moore refused. The track passed directly below the hill held by the partisans. Under those conditions, 17 men would only add to the casualty list. Moore turned the train around and went in search of a full relief force. On the return journey, the soldiers picked up the second messenger. He had been wounded twice, but was still walking toward the nearest station. The train eventually returned to Romanovka. This time, it carried 77 soldiers and a machine gun detachment. The arrival of reinforcements forced the partisans to withdraw. 19 Americans died at the scene. 26 were wounded. 5 of them later died. The American troops had not started the battle. They were defending themselves against a surprise attack. But the partisans did not see an accidental camp. They saw a foreign garrison protecting a strategic supply line. To Washington, this was a limited mission. To the Ruds, the Americans had become part of the enemy's military system.
American troops left northern Russia in the summer of 1919. The last units departed Siberia in the spring of 1920. Some of the expedition's official objectives were achieved. The Czechoslovak Corps was eventually evacuated, and part of the military stockpiles was protected. The American presence restricted the freedom of action of Japan and the Ottomans it supported. But the cost was far higher than anyone had expected. Americans fought the Red Army and Red Partisans. They nearly exchanged fire with the Japanese. They guarded weapons from their formal allies. Their own commanders could not always explain to the soldiers why the war was continuing. In northern Russia, official records counted 244 confirmed American deaths. More than 300 Americans were wounded. Dozens more were listed as missing. The troops had been sent to guard warehouses and a railway without interfering in Russia's internal affairs. But in a civil war, there was no such thing as a neutral railway, a neutral warehouse, or a neutral armed garrison.
The surviving soldiers returned home. Many of the dead remained buried in Russia, far from their families. The United States did not recognize the Soviet government. For years, that made it impossible to organize an official American expedition to recover the bodies. So the veterans began acting on their own. They formed the Polar Bear Association and collected letters, maps, photographs, and information about burial sites. 10 years later, 5 veterans returned to northern Russia with a recovery team. They carried old maps and traveled along the same rivers and railways they had once followed toward the front. The veterans searched abandoned cemeteries, spoke with local residents, and returned to the sites of their former battles. In one village, people who had stood on opposite sides during the war helped them locate a mass grave. One had taken part in an attack on the Americans. Another had housed American soldiers in his home. The identification tags in many graves had rusted away. The dead had to be identified by buttons, fragments of uniforms, and personal possessions. The remains were washed, wrapped in cloth, and placed in zinc coffins. The recovery expedition found the remains of 86 American soldiers. 84 were identified. 2 remained unknown. For the 5 veterans, this was their second journey to Russia. The first time, their government had never clearly explained why it was sending them there. The second time, the purpose was unmistakable. They had returned for the men who had been left in Russian soil.